Hey, Seven Marks, what's happening? Whether you're in the room, which I love, or you are watching online, man, we are glad that you made time to worship tonight with us. And if you are watching online, you will know that we recorded this ahead of time on Thursday night in anticipation of the, what do they call it, the bomb cyclone or something, the cyclone bomb that's coming to Raleigh this weekend. And I just, when I first saw that at the beginning of this week, I thought, man, last week it was a crippling ice storm. This week it is a cyclone bomb. Where do we get, the weather to where we just exaggerate everything that's happening? Why can't it just be, hey, we're going to get some heavy ice, or, we're going to get a lot of snow? No, we've got to have superlatives, and so maybe I need to use more of those in my talk. I don't know. But anyway, if you are at home watching, then that means we are snowed in, and so hopefully you are safe and warm, and maybe we'll get back to some kind of regular schedule. But if you are in the room tonight on Thursday, thank you. Man, it is way better to speak to people than empty chairs like Tyler had to do last week. So in fact, when we came in tonight, Justin said, hey, dude, what's up? How come you get to speak to people and Tyler speaks to empty chairs? It's just how it is. I don't know what else to say, but thank you for being here if you're in the room. Now, some of you know my story, not all of it maybe, but parts of it. But what I want to do tonight is I want to invite you back to a day in 1979. It was the summer of 1979. I was 14 years old, almost 15, or 15, almost 16. I can't remember. Anyway, and I was sitting on a bench in a pavilion, like an indoor pavilion. It was about half the size of this. It was summer camp, and it was in the middle of a lake, Scroon Lake, New York, on an island. And it was hot, and it was packed, and the speaker was giving this message, and to this day, I have no idea what he said. I can't remember the message, but at the end of the message, I responded. And so it must have been powerful enough to where I responded to whatever he was saying, and all I remember from that night is this little sticky, yellow sticky, that on the front of the yellow sticky it said, all I am, all I have, all I ever hope to be, I give to you. And it was a prayer that I prayed to the Lord. And to this day, I'm almost 62, I promise you, to this day, the only thing that I remember about that night is that little sticky and that little prayer that I prayed. Little did I know then what I know now is that I was being invited into a story that was bigger than I could ever imagine. But that story, that day, you got to know, that had a backstory. The only reason I was on that island is because a couple years earlier, my family was new to faith. We didn't know a whole lot. We were in this church, and there was a wealthy couple that every year they selected a family to send to this camp. So I'm one of 6 kids. We didn't have the financial ability to go to a camp like this with our family. We were just so new. We didn't know what Christian camps were all about. None of that. But that year when our whole family went, that's where my dad surrendered his life to the Lord. And then here I am a couple years later, and I'm sitting on this bench, and I have this little sticky that has the words, all I am, all I have, all I ever hope to be, I give to you. We never know how accepting God's invitation into his story will impact our life or the lives around us. And no doubt, you have the same story. Maybe not the same, but you have your backstory of where you find yourself in this very moment in this room or watching online. Maybe it's a story that you want to forget. Maybe it's a story that you don't remember all the details, or maybe it's something you just haven't thought about it in a while. But as we learn today, like our backstory matters. What happened in our past matters because, as we have said over the last several weeks, the story that we believe we are living in will direct how we live our life. And so we are in this series that we started in the beginning of the year, entitled Finding the Way Home, where we have opened up our Bible to discover the story that we have all been invited into, a story that is authored by the God of the universe that began long before we got here, and it will continue into eternity. And we've already learned a couple things as we've opened up the scriptures. One is this, that home, when we say finding the way home, home is to be in right relationship with God. That's how we were created, to be in relationship with him and right relationship with one another and with creation. But we learned that God messed up a long time ago when the first man and the first woman got on the planet and humanity rebelled against the story that God was inviting them into. And then humanity from that point on has been rebelling against God and trying to rewrite the story, a lesser false story. And as a result, humanity finds itself in exile to this very moment, away from home with God, in relationship with others, and creation. Which brings us to the second thing that we have learned in this series, our need for a rescue from ourselves and from our insistence of choosing and drifting into a lesser and false story. And only God can do that. Which brings us to this pattern that we have been awakened to, that goes through the entire scriptures, where God rescues, God forms, God dwells, and God sends. It's a thread that runs through the whole story of the Bible, and it finds its fulfillment in Jesus. And God is continually at work to this very day, in this very moment, inviting people into this bigger, better, truer story, bringing them out of exile and into a life that they were always intended to live. And there's no clearer picture of this in the Bible than a guy that we're going to look at tonight, who you are familiar with, the man Abraham. And so if you have your Bibles, I want to invite you to turn with me to Genesis chapter 12. And as you're turning there, man, let's quickly bring us up to speed and connect us from last week, where Tyler took us on this journey from when Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden. They were banished from a home where they were in perfect relationship with God and with one another and with creation. And then we find in the story, the further that humanity got from the garden, the worse it got, until where evil was flooding the earth. And then God sent a flood to wipe out evil from the earth. But he, in his love for humanity, he rescued humanity through Noah and his family. But soon after they came off the ark, it just spun up again. This downward spiral of humanity, because that's just what humanity does. And then Tyler led us all the way to the Tower of Babel. Humanity trying to find their way back home in their own way. And God sees the evil, and instead of destroying them like he did with the flood, he scatters them across the earth, setting the stage for him to again rescue humanity. Remember the pattern that God rescues, that God forms, God dwells, and God sends. But this time it's through an ordinary, everyday man, Abram, who God would later change his name to Abraham. So tonight you're going to hear me use both. And I don't know when I'm going to use them, but I'm going to use both, all right? But they're both one and the same. But starting at verse 1 of chapter 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you." And the response, so Abram went. 3 simple words. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. Now, most of us have heard about Abraham and the story of Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish people. His story covers 14 chapters of our Bible. And while we don't have the kind of time to walk through his whole story, I'm going to try and breeze through it. Okay, it's a series, it's probably multiple series in and of itself, but I'm going to walk through his stories, and I'm going to kind of pull out 3 lessons that we can learn after God rescues him and begins to form him. But first, there wasn't, like when you think about Abram, like let's just say you picked up the Bible and you started at page 1 and you started reading, and then all of a sudden you see this guy's name. And you're like, where did he come from? And why him? We don't see anything special or out of the ordinary about Abraham, that God would pick him over everybody else on the planet at that time. As far as we know from history, he was raised in an affluent home in most likely a prosperous region. And like anybody living in affluence and in a place where the future looked bright, he probably couldn't see himself living anywhere else on the planet. And then another detail we learn from Joshua chapter 24 is that his family, like the city, was full of gods. So polytheism was in the day. And Joshua tells us that his family worshiped these gods. So just a small detail, and why is that insignificant? Well, because he was just like us. He was living in an affluent region of the world, so are we. And he was giving himself to all different types of gods. So do we. Our gods may look a little bit different, but we can see ourselves in the story. Abraham wasn't rescued from exile because he had this impressive resume, or he had this proven character or a good track record, or he was getting everything right. He was called, and you need to hear this, he was called and chosen simply because of the gracious, merciful hand of God. That's my story. That's your story. If you're a child of God in the room, watching online, that is your story. We didn't get it right before God chose to reveal himself and invite us into his story and adopt us into his family, he rescues us and invites us into a bigger story just out of his love for us and out of his mercy, out of his grace, bringing us from exile, bringing us home and forming us. But in the forming, we all know that is a really messy process. But I want you to notice who's doing the forming when we start to look at Abram's story. See, at the Tower of Babel, away from God, humanity was looking to make a name for themselves. And we have a world of people that are doing that, by the way. Chasing the wrong story. But with Abram, God rescues him into a lifelong process of forming him where he himself is the author of his life. Listen, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Let's stop and think about that just for a minute. Who wouldn't want that? Right? Who wouldn't want that? To have a great nation made of me? To make my name great? To have my back to where I'm a blessing to people? Who wouldn't want that kind of life? We all would. The difference is that we want to say and how that's done. We want to say and how that's done and what it looks like. We want to control our own story. But that would be the wrong story. It's the first lesson we learn when we look to the life of Abraham. Entering God's story involves surrendering control. Don't rush by this. Just sit with this for a second. Abram left everything he knew. All the comforts of home. Anything that was familiar to him in order for God to write his story. It's a step that every one of us in the room watching online need to take. It's what I did almost 50 years ago now. I often get into these conversations with people about their faith story. And at some point in the conversation, I'm asking them, hey, tell me about when you came into relationship with Jesus. When did you surrender your life to him? And the response is, oh, man, I've always known Jesus. I grew up in the church, man. I went to church every day. Well, that would be like me saying, man, I have always loved Martha, my wife. I've always loved her. But the truth is, there was a day where Martha walked down the aisle. We had been dating for 5 years. And she stood in front of me. And we entered into this covenant relationship. That's what we see Abraham doing here. Stepping into a relationship with God and surrendering his life to him. So let me just stop for a second. So when was that for you? When was that for you? Whether you're watching online or in the room. I'll come back to that. For Abraham, he probably heard about Yahweh. Interesting fun fact, kind of Noah and Shem. He was from the line of Shem and Noah. they were all on the planet at the same time for like 39 years. So whether or not they bumped into each other, I don't know. But he had heard about Yahweh. But now he takes this step of faith and obedience, and it has become part of his story. And we see God now beginning to form him and dwell with him and eventually send him. But it's not all perfect. Like the formation of our life as a follower of Jesus is not all perfect. And that shouldn't surprise us about Abraham. After all, he was human. Initially, we see Abraham like responding, and then he builds this altar and worships the Lord, and it looks pretty prominent. Maybe humanity's really getting it right this time. But then adversity hits, and we've all been there, right? When something hits us and we don't know what to do. A famine hits, and what's interesting is that nowhere do we read Abram inquires of the Lord or calls out to God. What do I do now? What do I do with my family? How do we feed we don't see any of that. He was recently just worshiping at an altar. Now we find him drifting out of the right story, the one that God invited him into, something we all do, and he reverts back to what he knows. His own thinking without the counsel of God, and he goes down to Egypt. And that makes sense. I mean, there are people there and there are resources there. But before he does that, he tells his wife, hey, listen, you're really pretty. And so what I want you to do when we get to Egypt is I want you to lie and say that you're my sister. Because if they find out you're my wife, then they're going to kill me. And so they arrive in Egypt. She does what Abraham tells her to do. Pharaoh takes her and then treats Abraham really well. Look at that. Like Abraham took this thing, he took control, right? This lesser story, and things seem to be working out pretty good for him. But that's not the whole story. He has drifted from home. He's drifted from God and his instruction in his life. He has drifted from transparent relationships. And he is enjoying the created things instead of the Creator. Man, does that ever sound like us? It's not going to hurt anybody. It's not that bad. But God protects Sarah, and he ends up inflicting Pharaoh's house with disease, and Pharaoh finds out. He is furious at Abraham, and he drives him and his family out of Egypt. Isn't it interesting how that is a foreshadow to a narrative that's coming, that we're coming to? We're still in the backstory, but we're coming to Exodus, where the people are in Egypt in slavery, and God inflicts plagues on Pharaoh and his people, and Pharaoh drives the Israelites out. And as you follow the story of Abraham, you see that he would do the exact same thing later with King Abimelech. Same exact thing. Hey, lie. And what's interesting to me about those incidents is what God does. Seemingly nothing. Like he's not scolding Abraham. He's not there's no harsh words from God to Abraham. When you flip over to the next chapter, you see that after they've gone out of Egypt, Lot and him, the land can't hold Abraham and Lot, his nephew. They have too much stuff, and so they decide to break apart. And so after the debacle in Egypt and what was probably a tough separation from his nephew, God appears to him and says this in Genesis 13. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are. This is just after he messed up. to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. God reminds Abraham of his faithfulness, who he is, what he's called him to, despite Abraham's actions in Egypt. And then he reminds Abraham, this is who you are. This is what I'm going to do in you, for you, and through you. And it communicates to us a really, really valuable lesson. That when we drift, and we will, God gently reminds us of who he is and who we are. It's why we emphasize the spiritual practices around here and habits. Because it opens us up to hear God's voice about how he feels about us and who we are to him. It gives him space to form us. Somebody needs to hear this tonight, whether it's online or in the room. God is not looking for you to fail, to sin, so he can come and just crush you and beat you down for messing up. That's not him. If we're his children, he has chosen us and invited us into a better story, a truer story. And he wants nothing more than to draw our heart and our head and our hands toward that story. All we have to do is look to Luke 15, right? The story of the prodigal, where he comes to his dad, I want all my inheritance. He goes away, he squanders it in some rebellious living. But then he comes to his senses. And when he goes back to the father, what does the father do? Beat him? No. Scold him? No. Put his hand up and say, no, you're dead to me now. No. What does the father do? Runs to him and then rejoices that he has what? Come home. When we all drift, we do that because we lose sight of who Jesus, who we are in him. And what we've been called to do as his followers. That's why, man, we work so hard to point you to the scriptures, because in here you are continually reminded that you are loved and you are invited into a bigger story. But it doesn't mean that there aren't consequences when we choose a lesser story. We see that plainly as the story of Abraham continues. Abraham's getting older. You know the story, those of you that have been around church for a while. And he's trying to figure out, I have 0 descendants right now. My wife's getting old. She can't have kids. How is God going to make all of this work? And then we see in the beginning of chapter 17, Sarah is getting impatient. So she strongly suggests, amen, in here, like your wife has strongly suggested something to you. Yeah, suggest probably isn't the right word there. So she says, hey, sleep with my female servant, and we can build a family through her. And Abram's like, absolutely not. No, that's not what he said. Like humanity, he's like, okay. And so he does, and her female servant conceives and gives birth, and the consequence is incredible conflict and confusion, and all kinds of tension in the family. Those are the consequences of taking things into our own hands, trying to write our own story. Everybody is negatively impacted. We're impatient people, aren't we? We are so impatient. We don't want to wait for anything. Instant gratification is the theme of the day, and when things don't happen when we want them to happen, then we take the controls back and we try and make something happen. That's what they did. And when we do that, we all have, when we do that, we see the consequences and we are reminded of them in the future, of the mistakes we've made in the past. But again, I love what we see in the story. God doubles down on his faithfulness and promise. In chapter 17, we see this beautiful exchange between God and Abraham. It's the Abrahamic covenant. Verse 1, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants and you for generations to come, after you for generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Despite Abraham and Sarah taking things into their own hands, trying to control the story, doing what humans do, God continues to communicate his faithfulness. But this is really important. God does something now that he hasn't done to this point. After God changes his name, he calls him to physically demonstrate his side of the covenant by having every male circumcised. Why? I don't know. But isn't it interesting that God has Abraham mark the part of his body that he used earlier to try and write a different story with the female servant? Abraham responds in obedience, and he leads all the men in obedience to do the same. And what we start to see this incredible, that was no easy thing that he was being asked to do and to lead the men of his family to do. But we see God forming him into a man of faith and trust as he called him to obedience, which brings us to our final lesson. Living and growing in God's story demands a growing level of obedience. We don't like that as followers. We just don't. I don't know what to tell you. We just don't. We'll see later in Abram's story, which is probably the most popular part of his story, where Sarah does give birth to a son, the son of promise, Isaac, and then soon after that, God asks him to sacrifice his only son, which Abram goes all the way to the brink with knife in hand, but within sight of the altar, God stops him and directs him to a ram that's caught in the thicket. And that ram is sacrificed in place of his son. All of this imagery to the death of Jesus on our behalf. God's response: the angel of the Lord called to Abraham Genesis 22, verse 16. From heaven a second time, and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on the earth will be blessed, because you have what? Obeyed me. Abraham's faith and trust in God was tested. So it begs the question, can we trust God? Knows what he is doing in our life when it just doesn't make sense to us. How about when it does make sense, but it's just hard? Because we want to do our own thing. We want to control our own story. We've all been in those moments where we're like, am I going to choose to obey in this moment or not? A favorite saying of mine that I can constantly remind myself of is, we are educated far beyond our level of obedience. We know more than we do. That's why the conversation of going deeper in the scriptures drives me crazy. I'm all for it. I think knowledge of him is amazing, because the depth of your knowledge, you understand his love. But my hang up is, I just don't see the obedience following the depth into the word. If God's the author of the story that he is living, that he's inviting us into, then he calls the shots, all of them. And we respond in faith and in the power of the Holy Spirit that's inside of us to do what he's calling us to do. So what step of obedience is he calling you to tonight? It could be as simple as being fully present with your spouse or with your kids. In this winter season, it could be looking to your neighbor and how you can help, shoveling or whatever else. It could be showing hospitality to your neighbor and inviting them into your home for dinner. It could be turning from a habitual sin, or getting help from an addiction, or walking away from a toxic relationship. It may be stepping into a community group or helping somewhere in the city. I don't know what it is for you, but I do know that living and growing in God's story is not a passive walk into the future life that he has for you. We can all see ourselves in Abraham's story. Maybe for some in the room, it's receiving God's invitation into his story and surrendering control of your life to him. Maybe for others, you have found yourself drifting into another story, and you need to come back to the Father. Or maybe for others, it's taking the next step of obedience, whatever that may be for you. Whatever it is, know that on the other side of whatever move you make, there is a Father who loves you, who is faithful, and who is a covenant-keeping God that is actively forming you into the image of his Son.